Philippines, and you begin to see, that we represent a large portion of the development of this society, of this world, and then when we come to learn about it, it's gone. And so by identifying with the diaspora, we're able to make the connections and the links and see, a sense of solidarity versus antagonisms, which is what a white supremacist, capitalist, imperialist society will do to you.
That's right.
And so part of us as a Culture Cafe is to address cultural imperialism by creating a cultural alternative, by showing films like this, having discussions like this, eating some food like that, and we can it down the way we want to.
That's right. I guess there are two things that came for me from the film. And one was I was really looking for the voice of Africans from the continent. Because I think for me that is always what is missed when we talk about African diaspora. Because there's this sense that the diaspora is everything outside of the continent, right? And that the continent doesn't play a way and doesn't have a place in the development of the diaspora, and the diaspora doesn't have a place in the development of Africa. And I think that you cannot separate those two. If Africa is not developed in the way that it needs to be, then African diaspora cannot be. And if the African diaspora is not, then Africa won't also. So for me, I was really looking for that voice of Africans from the continent, which I feel is always missing. And when it is there, it's showing up as, oh, let us talk about the culture that we bring to the table in terms of how does it link to what's going on outside, and not sort of the conversation that Juliet brought up in terms of there's an assumption that there's a consciousness on the continent, and that consciousness is not there. And in a lot of spaces, and even when you talk about some of the African scholars that come out of the continent, that consciousness is not there. So I think for me, needing to talk about what does it mean to have a consciousness on the continent, and how does that link to having a bigger consciousness within the diaspora. And the second point that I wanted to bring up was that I do understand and I appreciate is I move in the spirit in which there's this sense of blackness and us coming together and seeing that link and seeing that connection. But I also move in the spirit that there's differences among us as black people.
Oh, absolutely.
And sort of us figuring out, because some of the people who don't know me, my father's Nigerian, my mother is African American, Shreveport, Louisiana. And so I grew up in a household where I definitely saw what is black and what is African. But I also grew up in a household that I saw what does it mean to be an African with generations and generations here in America, and an African who's the first generation here in America. And there's differences, and those differences are beautiful. And they can be in the same space of blackness, and we don't have to say you are more African than you are because you have an African name and you don't. You're more African than you are because you've been baptized under Jesus Christ and you haven't. You practice Ifá. So I think that there's something that we need to talk about within ourselves about this conversation of who is more black than who and who is more African than who. Because I think that also doesn't allow us to be different within our space of blackness.